Hey, I'm Ronald Mah. I am the MFT instructor. It's important that what we do here is we are an inclusive, respectful organization. Therefore, negative or judgmental, discriminatory commentary is very much discouraged. Try to be very respectful of each other, interact that way. We have guests and we have students. I want the students take about 30 seconds to a minute to introduce yourself to everybody, and I'll introduce myself at the end. This is the second workshop. It's called, conflict control and out of control in couples and couples therapy, which is really about all kinds of therapy, but also about domestic violence and the continuum that we're going to be talking about.
All right, you guys. Good to see everybody. My name's Steven. I'm a MFT and LPC student at Wiser. I'm about 2/3 done with my program. I'm also a 6th grade teacher in San Francisco and doing my practicum at the Liberation Institute in San Francisco. Really enjoy Wiser and the program so far. I'm looking forward to today's seminar, as it definitely will be relatable to a couple I'm seeing. So thank you, Ronald.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Mary Beth. My pronouns are they, them. I am about halfway, a little bit more than halfway through my program. I am in a practicum at Pacific Center. Practicing is so much different than just hearing theories. It's pretty amazing when you're in a session and you're like, oh, that's this theory. Okay, all right, what's going on here? It's interesting how when you practice too, you do something and you're like, where did that come from? And then you think about it and it's like, oh, that's that theory. So it's interesting how it all connects together. Understanding theory and doing practice is so different. I'm really enjoying it.
I'm Melvi. Yeah. I'm a new student, an MFT student at Wiser. I started in August. I'm very excited. This is my second career. Background is in human resources. The aspect I liked most about it was working with people. So this is a great transition for me. And thus far, I'm excited to be at Wiser, great support system, and definitely like what I'm learning. Thanks.
Yeah. Rachel, yeah.
Hello, I'm from England. I'm a psychotherapist. I've just started learning couples therapy through Tavistock Relations in London. Saw this advertised online, and especially with COVID and the increase in domestic abuse, just thought it would be incredibly helpful. So I'm really looking forward to learning as much as I can.
Cool. I'm glad. Guest from England. How cool is that with the internet? Tanisha.
Hi, I'm Tanisha. I am here in New York, and I am a licensed social worker. I definitely saw the event on Eventbrite, and also with the increase in domestic violence, just like Rachel, I thought that this would be a good opportunity to come and, hear and see what you had to say about it. I work with couples as well.
Let's see. I'm Ronald Mah. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I got my master's degree here at Wiser. Sounds like Rachel and Tanisha are already licensed people and practicing. But it's a master's program, and it's definitely a West Coast, Berkeley-ish, liberal, progressive, social justice-oriented program. And the big emphasis here is that we look at people's life experiences and see that as really, really important part of their work. And as Stephen and Mary Beth know, if I give them feedback, because they tend to do excellent work anyway, a lot of times the feedback is, so what does this mean to you? In other words, applying it to the real world. And now that Mary Beth and Stephen both are in the practicums, they're in the real world. Intoxicating, amazing, it's like, wow. Sometimes you're just scrambling. And I think what you just said, Mary Beth, is really relevant in that you basically react and follow through instinctively. And then usually after the fact, you say, oh, yeah, that does have to do with that theory, because you can't work from a theory place usually. That's more or less having a hammer and deciding that you need to hit everything because it must be a nail, and that just doesn't work very well. So that's us. We also do doctorate programs. It's called Higher Education and Social Change. I got my master's in psychology back in 91 at Wiser. I've been teaching there ever since. And 2009, 2013, I got my doctorate degree there as well, called Higher Education and Social Change. So if you want to do a doctorate that is focused on what you want to do, then you can go ahead and do it. This particular workshop is based on one of my doctorate topics. Actually, it's part of my dissertation. And I did 10 projects, which ended up being 10 ebooks on complications in couples therapy. And then I did 10 topics, major complications in couples and couples therapy, which became the dissertation. And they're all self-published ebooks. You can actually now, you could go buy the books, which cost you a couple of bucks, or you go to my website, which is ronalmah.com, and you could read these books are on my website. They're free. And I practice here in the San Francisco East Bay area. I work with teenagers, I work with kids, do family therapy, do a lot of couples therapy. And I get a lot of the crazy couples or the couples who've been referred because something else didn't work. Something else was really complicated and problematic. So that's couples with affairs, couples with eating disorder, with addictions, including eating disorders, but addictions of various kinds, and also personality disorders, in particular narcissism. Basically decided to call this about Madeline and Dirk. Mad Madeline and Dirk the Jerk. Conflict control and out of control in couples and couples therapy. And part of the premise here is that we're going to do couples therapy. And with couples therapy, why do people come into couples therapy in the first place? Because you usually have some kind of issue. The framing question I usually ask people in the beginning is this something new, or is this something that's old, that's gotten more intense over time? Or is it both? Is it something new or something that gotten more intense over time? Now, if it's something new, that could be discovery of an affair, a financial crisis, or something like that. But oftentimes it is both because it's something ongoing. That there's always been some communication issues. There's always been some disagreements and tension, and maybe the affair is an outcome, or the addiction or the drinking is an outcome of the dysfunction, the unhappiness in it as well. And a lot of times people call and say, "Hey, we need a couples therapy. We have communications problem." And my response always is, "Well, there's communications problem, but it's not so much the communication problem. It's the problem communication problem causes, which is you hurt each other. You hurt each other, and now there's injuries that need to heal." In this is we're going to talk about this is that in the continuum of interactions, all the time as therapists, we're always working with people to be more assertive. Okay, to assert themselves, to have a voice. Very much a Western European American style of therapy, which is to assert yourself, have a voice, to say what you want, and so forth. And that is expressed in communications therapy. So a lot of times we teach people to assert themselves. However, there's a continuum to look at, which is that with assertiveness, this continuum of assertiveness, that in order to be assertive, sometimes you could slide over to being aggressive. And it might be quite appropriate to be aggressive. But then the continuum goes further, is that the assertion can become aggression, can become abusive. And that's where we start having problems. So teaching somebody how to be assertive, teaching them how to be appropriately aggressive, but sometimes teaching them how to be aggressive without becoming abusive. And what happens is there's anger. And anger, you got to remember, anger is a secondary emotion. Secondary emotion because the primary emotions are sadness, depression, anxiety, fears, hurt, loss, pain, things like that. Those are the vulnerable emotions. And because they're vulnerable emotions, as someone feels weak, loses power, anger as a secondary emotion is also an empowering emotion. So a lot of times in couples therapy, I have to teach people how to be angry because they don't know how to be angry. Because the anger they saw was hostility, anger, so forth. If you remember, some of you might remember family or other people when they get into an argument, they're angry, but they act like they hate each other. They want to destroy each other. There's such a toxicity in it. In an American scheme of things, Rachel, you probably hear about it from way over there on the other side of the ocean. But we have a really toxic political situation right now. There's such hostility. Of course, you got Boris Johnson too, so you guys got your stuff over there too. But the hostility, the anger, where there's disagreements, so forth. But it's acting like you hate each other and this is, and in the political realm, people treat each other as if they're enemies. But then two people who are married, maybe even have children together, treat each other as if they're enemies. The hostility, the hatefulness. So this is why such an important continuum, which is not to be not angry, but how to be angry appropriately. Because you tell somebody not to be angry, essentially you're telling them, give up the power that drives your assertiveness. Give up your self-determination, your voice, and so forth. So how to be appropriately angry? In my own life experiences growing up, there's certain things that I'm angry about, certain things I'm still angry about. and that they motivate me to take action, to assert myself. So that becomes part of a couples therapy. Okay, now in that, now we're talking about domestic violence. Okay, now why this is such an important thing is that there's couples therapy, and then there's domestic violence therapy, and there's different kinds of domestic violence therapy where it's recommended. But why does anybody come to couples therapy? Anybody comes to couples therapy, the most benign, lovely couple who communicate, really connected, is they come to couples therapy because somehow in their interactions they hurt each other. Not just communication, they hurt each other. They hurt each other in a way that feels disrespectful, debilitating, attacking their self-esteem, their sense of self, their sense of competence, taking away their power and control. And because of that, there is emotional injury, emotional violence. So that emotional violence becomes what we're talking about, what we're dealing with. And then on some kind of continuum, the emotional violence might be more of omission rather than of commission, not doing things. Or it could be passive aggressive, not making a phone call, misplacing something, doing a chore, kind of doing it half-assed or whatever else. Or it might be more verbal in terms of toxic language, nasty, mean, ugly languages. If any of you done couples therapy, sometimes the language is just so toxic, but sometimes it's actually subtly toxic. In fact, sometimes it could be without words. Somebody says something and the other person goes, which is basically a big fu, a big dismissal of the person. It's an annihilation, and that kind of behavior is completely damaging. Or somebody says something. Actually, I had a client who did that to me. I gave her some feedback about something, and then she goes, okay, and I go, what do you mean okay? I just told you, but I spent a couple of minutes explaining this to you. She goes, I heard you. I go, and well, I heard you, which is basically a big fu, because it's like I heard you, but I take there's nothing to it. There's no meaning to it. So the lack of interaction, the lack of reflection can be in some ways that's even more of a nuking, because you're being ignored. To be yelled at, you are there to be yelled at. To be ignored, you're eliminated. You don't matter at all. And the key thing about passive aggressive behavior is passive aggressive behavior has what I call plausible deniability. What? I didn't do nothing. Well, that's the whole damn point. You did nothing in this passive aggressive way. Plausible deniability. And the thing to keep understand about passive aggressive behavior is passive aggressive behavior is aggressive. It is aggressive, and it will wear people down. And but plausible deniability, it also takes away responsibility. Takes away responsibility. So some people come to couples therapy not because of a lot of overt things, but because of the passive aggressive things. Now at some point it becomes domestic violence therapy, or it's not physical violence, but it's verbal violence, insults and so forth, because now it's shifting to overt behavior. So this is why this particular topic is not just about domestic violence or couples out of control, anger, and so forth. It's about all therapy, all couples therapy. So domestic violence therapy, however, the basis of domestic violence therapy is first of all safety. Safety first. Maybe safety and risk reduction, but safety first. In other words, if that's your biggest command mandate, is that you got to make sure that people are safe. And the thing about that that's so critical is one or both of the partners might be looking at you as, you, the therapist, save us, save me, and save us. And the save me might be, I am being victimized, save me. But the other aspect of it is, I'm perpetrating. I'm being an asshole. I'm being verbally, emotionally violent, if not physically violent, if not sexually violent. Save me from what I'm doing. So for you to set that boundary is really critical. And you see people who will deny it and so forth. So taking, so that the therapist might be the one and only hope to intervene. So I think it's really why this assertiveness. So like whenever I work with somebody and I start getting a sense of any kind of violence there, I start asking about it. I said, how far does it go? We fight sometimes. What do you mean you fight? Tell me how you fight. What happens? And I ask specifically, is it language? Yes. Is it language? Okay. What else is there? Is there behavior? Is there hitting? And you hear key quibble words. Watch out for quibble words. And the quibble words is a key quibble word is just. I just is BS. I just hit. I just terrorized. I just attacked. I just stuck in the knife part way. I mean, that's a BS term. Or another quibble statement is not really. You'll watch for it, and you need to be really direct to find out. And if you find out there's any history of it, if it's once, if it's twice, used to be, you as a therapist often, we're human beings. We don't want to hear about bad crap. We don't want to hear about bad crap. We can't blow it off. We're avoidant. It's kind of like, if we say, did it really happen? That's you avoidant, and you're being irresponsible, because remember, you might be the one and only chance for this person to get saved. So you need to be really relentless and ask the extra question, ask the extra question, ask the extra question. And if you find out there's violence, in terms of safety and risk reduction, the safety things, I'll turn to the person who's been victimized, who has received the violence, and say, this is unacceptable. If this person does this again, or there's a threat to do this again, you get the hell out of the house and you call the police. Absolutely. That's what you got to do, because safety is first. You cannot do therapy. You cannot negotiate. You're not going to build this relationship under this threat. And I'll look at the other person. You hear that? He or she is going to call the cops on you. And if I find out about it, I'm going to call the cops on you, because I'm not going to play around with this. I'm not going to be intimidated by that. And that in of itself does risk reduction, because what happens is that as long as behavior is available, behavior will be used. Okay? People might still do it. You have to be absolutely clear. This is unacceptable. Now, this is a really key issue, because what happens is that in the modern American world and the Western world, we're seeing a lot of this, which is that people get in the place of self-righteousness. They get in the place of self-righteousness that they have the moral ascendancy. You did me wrong. You insulted me. You're disrespectful for me. You have evil thoughts. You have the different political orientation. I hold the high moral ground. For me hiding the high moral ground, what that gives to me is entitlement. See, what does entitlement mean? Entitlement means that the rules don't apply to me. The rules don't apply to me. I can break the rules. In other words, I can make sexualized, objectifying comments about women. I can be transphobic. I can be, homophobic. I can be racist. I could be xenophobic. I could be cruel, disrespectful, and hurtful, because I hold the high moral ground. I'm right, you're wrong, you're evil, you're blasphemous, and therefore I'm entitled to my own set of rules, or the rules don't hold part of me. This is the second pair of the two pairs of major characteristics of narcissism. See, narcissism, the two pairs are omnipotence, which I'm the best, grandiosity, which is I'm special. Grandiosity, omnipotence, I'm the best, I'm special. Self-righteousness is I hold the high moral ground. I'm morally superior than you. Therefore, out of those three, but especially that because of self-righteousness, I'm entitled to my own set of rules. I get to grab women. I get to say racist stuff. I get to be violent, insultful, break professional decorum, violate the Constitution or the parliamentary laws or whatever else, because I'm entitled to. That's extremely dangerous. And you will see that in couples therapy and couples relationships. You did this to me, therefore I'm entitled to do that to you. Now, I work with teenagers as well. And one of the main things I did with teenagers was, this is a common teenage rule. Well, they always go, yeah, I respect people. You got to respect each other. You got to give each other respect. And respect is, that's cool. But then what happens is that respect ends up being, I respect you, you respect me, we're cool. But what happens if I do something that inadvertently, without my intention, is disrespectful to you? And then upon that, the person takes the entitlement. You disrespected me, so I can fuck you up. I can insult you. I could do nasty, mean things to you. That's totally inappropriate because, and my feedback to that is that I did that to you. I messed up. That's an accident. In other words, I put my hand in the mud, in the crap, and I flung it at you. That's my bad. I did it by accident. I take responsibility for it. On the other hand, you are digging your hand in the crap on purpose. You are doing it knowingly because you're taking that entitlement. Okay. And that can't play. And this is where I project myself into it. I say, which is that there's nothing you can do that can make me disrespect you, because that's me holding myself to this higher code, personal code. This is a huge aspect in couples therapy and couples relationships where there's emotional violence to other violence, is that when people take the entitlement that because you did me wrong, I can do you wrong purposefully. If you could expose that rule and change that rule so they will instead go that, okay, if you do me wrong, I still won't do you wrong on purpose. Now, after that might be, I will check to see if I did you wrong, how I did you wrong, take responsibility for it. But I will not purposely give myself the entitlement to do that. If you could get people to accept that rule. So in the situation where I'm talking about, where I'm talking with the couple at the beginning, which is that, is there any domestic violence? What kind of violence? What happened? And I will, this whole thing about the therapist being a blank slate. Yeah, no. I hold some rules. I said, no, that's bullshit. That's not acceptable. That's not acceptable. Is that acceptable to you? If you think that's acceptable, you're always going to be at risk, because one way or the other, one time or the other, not on purpose necessarily, but probably by accident, you will do something. Your partner will think that you you were disrespectful, and they will crucify you. That cannot play. You're not safe. Do you accept that this redefinition of the rules? In other words, never any entitlement. If you could get people to hold that rule, you hold them accountable. And that has to do with a concept from self-esteem theory. It's called the ideal self versus the real self. The ideal self being, this is who you think you are. This is who you want to be, ideally. This is me living up completely with the morals and values that I believe in. So if I have this ideal self, then my real self tries to live up to it. So basically what you're doing is you're challenging, you're evoking the person's ideal self, and you're trying to invoke a redefinition. So what do you think? Are you a good person? Yes, I am a good person. Are you a person who's kind, respectful, treat people well? Yes, you am. Do you hold yourself to high moral values? Yes. Do you allow yourself to be hurtful, mean, and nasty if someone else is hurtful, mean, and nasty? Because that's not that high. If you could get that translated to accept that I will seek to be this good person who doesn't hurt other people no matter what, then you can start working on the real self. The real self behaviors to translate to that. That in of itself creates safety, but also reduces risk. So, which is why sometimes when there's a couple in front of me and they're talking to me about, I'm asking them about any history of violence, aggression, and so forth, in front of the perpetrator, the person who's been violence, I will do safety plans with the person who has been victimized. I want them to know this is the consequence. Are you willing to call police on them? Is there a place you can get away fast? Who are your allies who could save you if this person becomes crazy? So you know that now, right? They're going to call cops on you. They're going to get the hell out of there, and that's good for you because they're going to get the hell out of there, or what they're going to do first is get the hell out of there, so they don't have to call the cops on you. That's better for you because once the cops are involved, there's a whole lot more trouble. Therapy starts with protection and prevention. Okay, that's where the risk reduction is. And risk reduction may include something as simple as when you guys have a fight, if it gets to a point of heat, then you, if you can, stop yourself from fighting. Say, we'll talk about it in therapy. We'll talk about it with Ronald. We'll talk about it with Tanisha, with Mary Beth, or whatever. Talk about somebody else. And the point of that why that's so important, is that when somebody's activated, they're going to be reactive, instinctive, stupidly, even dangerous. So there's so much of therapeutic processes. If you could put a pause in it, anything that creates a pause does two things. A pause stops you from doing what you're already doing, which is dysfunctional, not working. And the second thing it does, it gives you the possibility of trying something else. Okay. So if you say, like, let's finish this fight, this argument, at therapy on Tuesday with Stephen. Okay, that's cool. That will help them to do that. Now you want to explore the cycles of behavior, about the communication. Now that includes the family of origin stuff. A common question that I use with the couple, the individuals, is that how did your parents fight? How did your parents do anger? Because there's a model. You learn from that, okay? And the models are really telling. And sometimes the models are that it was nasty, it was angry, it was toxic, it was violent. I says, oh, so you're doing like your parents did, which really is really upsetting to them, which might be their motivation coming to therapy. Or sometimes the answer is, well, they didn't fight. I go, what do you mean they didn't fight? Well, they didn't fight. So how did your family do anger? How did your family, people in your family express do anger? And they go, well, I didn't see much of that. I said, what do you mean? And then whereupon, I remember one case, the wife goes, well, tell Ronald. Well, so that's why I was so surprised when they got divorced when I was 12 years old. Why? Because they didn't do anger in front of the kids. They didn't fight in front of the kids. Behind me, the calligraphy right there, is the calligraphy for learning. Study and practice. That's learning. How do you learn how to do anything, including how to have conflict with your intimate partners? From models. You study it, and then you practice it as well. His parents would go to the bedroom, and they would argue there, and they would never know anything. So he was clueless. He's absolutely clueless. Didn't know how to assert himself. Now this other guy, his parents felt angry and nasty, and basically he swore up and down that he was never going to do that to his family, his partner. And then whereupon I put it to her, it says, you realize that him being emotionally stoic and shutting you off is that you think he's cutting you off, but that's an act of love on his part. She goes, what the hell do you mean act of love? Because he swore that he would never do to you what he did to what he saw his parents do to each other. So he just shuts down. Isn't that so? I look at him, and his face is kind of like in shock because I nailed him. I nailed him on what he did and the practice part of it, which is why sometimes if you do couples therapy, you want to see them have a fight in front of you because you want to see how they do it. You want to see if they do it passive aggressively. You want to see if they shut down. You see if they do intimidation, anger, superiority. You want to see how they do it. And then you find out how much it's like from a family model. There's also cultural things as well. Now, the communication, we'll talk more about communication as we go along. Hurtful communications need to be identified. What is hurtful? What is damaging? And the sensitivities are exposed and they're honored. But sensitivity is that, there's verbal communications, expressive verbal communications that you want to identify. There's certain things that you can't say that trigger me, don't trigger me. But there's also other communications that are nonverbal communication, being late, being on time, bringing a gift, bringing the wrong gift. I swear, somebody gave me a gift one time. I think they were at Costco and they just happened to be walking past the aisle with a big can of cashews, and that's what I got for a birthday present. It's like, oh, that's pretty unthoughtful, So that's kind of like, what does that mean? Or I'll give you my psychological algebra now. Psychological algebra is 1 + 1 + 1 = 10. Well, that don't add up. 1 + 1 + 1 doesn't equal 10. Well, when does it equal 10? That doesn't make sense. Well, because there's an X factor. X + 1 + 1 + 1 = 10. In other words, what's the trauma? What's the attachment issue? What's the cultural issues? What's the role models that make it so that it adds up? So I do this thing. Maybe I do this thing. I buy my wife some Tupperware, something dumb like that. And she's aggravated as hell. What? That doesn't add up. We like Tupperware. We use Tupperware. Why is she mad? Well, it turns out actually, I'll give you a better example. So this Mexican American couple, both child of immigrants, both professionals, both doing really well, and he asked her to serve him dinner, and basically her response is, "Oh hell no, get your own damn dinner." So what's the big deal about him asking her to serve dinner? Well, in his 1 + 1 + 1, in his life, his mother, raised the 5 kids, and the way she honored and respected her dad, his dad, her husband, was to make him dinner, a very traditional model. So he wanted to be honored and respected that way and loved that way as well. On the other hand, that doesn't add up for her to be so angry and so reactive. Make your own fucking dinner. Her response. Get yourself your own food. But what happened was that she comes from a traditional family, and her mother served her father as well. But her father was dominating and abuse trolling. And the serving of dinner was a way that he manifested that power and humiliated her mom. And oh hell no, I didn't get out of that household, go to college, become a professional, to have some Mexican husband treat me like that again. One of the famous 5-letter words in terms of therapy, happening again. In other words, it doesn't add up. Okay, and this is what you're looking at. Why does he have that desire? Why does she have that sensitivity? And what did they end up doing? I don't even know what they did doing. They did takeout, they did microwave. It doesn't matter anymore. But now we know why it's so sensational, and they can work it all out afterwards. Now, just like emotional abuse, okay, just like child abuse, child abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, physical abuse, all child abuse is emotional abuse. All domestic violence is emotional psychological, because what's the meaning of it? I hit you, I hurt you, I caused you pain and terror. That don't matter because you don't matter. I sexually violate you, take advantage of you, messes up your ability to have intimacy relationships. That don't matter because you don't matter. Emotional abuse, I humiliate you, make you hate yourself. That don't matter because you don't matter. I ignore you because you don't matter. Domestic violence is you don't matter. So much of the couples therapy is about mattering. And another aspect of the mattering part, it would be, which is not uncommon with a lot of guys, is the sense of appreciation, that they don't feel appreciated, which is about mattering. Now, part of that is like the trap of it is that in the male culture, a lot of appreciation is that you're supposed to be appreciated, but you don't advertise yourself. You don't promote yourself. So you're still somehow supposed to be noticed. And depending on where people are from, they don't necessarily recognize what you do. And bottom line is that whatever I do, you can't possibly, I use this as a closing to one of my workshops. Mary Beth and Stephen probably heard me say this before. At the end of my workshops, I say, I hope you enjoy what I've done, but the bottom line is you can't appreciate me to the degree I deserve. Well, why can't you appreciate me to the degree I deserve? The reason you can't appreciate me to the degree I deserve is because you don't know what it took for me to get here. You don't know what it took for me to get here. You don't know what happened in my life, become this person, do this thing that you appreciate. So how can you possibly appreciate me? There is a definition of static and dynamic risk factors. So these are conceptual stuff. And a lot of the conceptual stuff, people give names to it. That's cool. But on the other hand, you intuitively, you might understand this already, but this is often useful. So static risk factors are that part of the history of the offender that predict recidivism, that they'll do it again. It's not necessarily you can intervene, do anything about it. So what's that history? That could be they've hurt somebody else before. They come from a family or a cultural background where there's been violence. Those are static factors. They're important to know that because that indicates the propensity, the likelihood. But then there's dynamic risk factors. Now within dynamic risk factors, there's there's stable risk factors and then acute factors. So stable risk factors are those that are expected to remain relatively constant over time. For example, if someone's an alcoholic, the fact that they're an alcoholic, now even more so if they're using stimulant drugs like methamphetamines and so forth, that's some really dangerous stuff because stimulant drugs, methamphetamines create anger and aggression. That's a stable factor, the alcohol. But an acute risk factor is closely linked to the reoffending, like drinking right now or a job loss right now. So in this character here, this character Dirk uses alcohol, okay? That's a dynamic and stable risk factor, okay? But then what are the triggers? Getting in trouble at work, a bill that's unexpected. So part of that therapy-wise is we do therapy, right? We talk about triggers, avoiding triggers. But the understanding that is that he is triggerable. He is triggerable. In other words, is that because otherwise, if you focus on triggering the avoiding triggers, that makes Madeline responsible for him being an asshole, for him being violent and out of control. It's worth addressing, it's worth doing. See, but part in the presentation of the couples therapy is someone like Dirk goes on and on and on about, well, if she didn't do this, if she didn't do that, then he focuses on her triggering him, making her responsible. So this is the language of irresponsibility for a perpetrator. Excuse my language, but it goes something like that. If she wasn't such a bitch, she wouldn't have gotten hit. Now, if you listen to that language, besides its profanity, if she wasn't such a bitch, she wouldn't have got hit. What's missing? What's missing is the personal pronoun I. She did this and I was hurt and angry and I hit her. And that's what's missing in there. If she wasn't such a bitch, she wouldn't have gotten hit. If she wasn't such a bitch, my hand would not have flown up on its own accord, and her face wouldn't have drawn it against her, my hand against her face. That's a giving up responsibility. So be really aware when you talk about triggers, about the responsibility. What triggers you? Fine. What triggers you? But then responsibility is still the key here. This kind of conversation, as therapists, you can understand it, you can use it, but at the same time, it's also like, how able is somebody able to, for technical terms, how differentiated people are. Is that how much are they likely to understand all this stuff? Understand, accept the emotional processes, the reactivity. How much are they to relate and the needs, and which includes empathy. So one of the questions of if you recognize that someone is the perpetrator, is that you ask them, how do you imagine your partner feels? What do you think he or she, they feel, knowing that this can happen? You want to listen to that, because if they go off into, it's her or his fucking fault, that's too bad, and everything else, there's clearly a lack of differentiation, of owning a responsibility. That's a different kind of therapy. As opposed to, you speak to the person and they say, this must be awful. I feel really bad for them to go through that, because I know I could be so difficult. It's a different type of work. This has to do with the premise, which is also why we were talking about domestic violence therapy in the first place, is some people don't recommend domestic violence therapy, couples therapy, when there's domestic violence. And I think the thing to understand about that is that there's different types of domestic violence. There's domestic violence where it's like clearly not indicated, it's not safe. But there's also forms of domestic violence where couples therapy might be appropriate. And differentiation is a big part of it, if it's genuine differentiation. The ability to have empathy is all part of that. Male partners often fear loss of power, control, and their role certainty, because they're used to being the man, so to speak. Female partners, they'll minimize their own emotional experience, the fear of being physically hurt. There's other barriers, which include economic barriers to leaving. This is pretty obvious. Lower differentiation occurs when anger is exposed and too quick for rational evaluation or diversion. That's where the pause part of it comes in. Pause. Any kind of pause allows for the possibility of something to be different. Guilt and shame can be a motivation, but also can be counterproductive, because people will get stuck in it and feel doomed. This is a very important nuance of it. We tend to look at people who are victims, who experience being victim. A victim person as someone who's meek, passive, boo-hoo, boo-hoo, boo-hoo. But see, there's another kind of victim style, which is a loud, angry, aggressive victimhood. You could see that maybe in the political landscape right now, where people are asserting that certain people are asserting that they're being victimized. But out of that victimhood, so this is a more general definition. From a sense of deprivation can come a sense of entitlement. I've been victimized, I've been taken advantage of, I've been exploited, I've experienced racism or sexism, I'm entitled. I'm entitled to break the rules, change things, be different, things like that. Sometimes that translates into a loud, angry victim, which is the entitlement to hit, hurt, and be violent. One of the things that is often useful, very provocative, is that if you see a perpetrator do the loud, angry victimhood, like, what the fuck you expect me to do when he or she does this, is that you call it as a victim stance. You call it as a victim stance. Says, what do you mean? You have no choice but being an asshole? You mean you have no power and control whatsoever, that your behavior is automatic? You're saying that you're wimpy and don't have any self-control, and that challenges their self-identification, their identification. Breaking the negative cycle. Part of differentiation with that pause is to break the negative cycle. I use a mnemonic Mary Beth and Stephen heard it before. It's called A to the first, I to the second, E to the third. A stands for awareness. Are you aware within your own body of what you feel? And this awareness is all the flight or fight symptoms. Your heart beating fast, the cold sweat, the galactic skin response, the clammy hands, the cold feet because blood's going to the big muscles to run or fight, your stomach churning, the hyped up energy, the adrenaline that's in your body, the tachycardia, the shortness of breath, the setting of the jaw, all these things. These are all things to get ready to fight. So you teach people awareness that this is connected, but you teach this not just to the person who's been victimized, but the person who's a perpetrator, that they have a physiological response that's being activated. And this is based on a premise that both the victim and the perpetrator feel victimized, feel in danger. But the perpetrator deals with the danger by being aggressive, by being bullied. A to the first is that's awareness. That's physiological self-awareness. I to the second, the first I is having insight. And this is where the examination of prior history, culture, family models, and things come into play. This is me feeling scared, like when my mother did this to me or when my father did that. This has to do with the kids bullying me. This has to do with being humiliated back when I was a teenager, not just right now. This has to do with my power control issues. That's insight. Now, once you have insight, what the awareness cues you to, what's this about, takes you to insight, then the insight already does the second I, which is interrupt, which is a mental cognitive interruption. Because when people don't have that pause, don't have that differentiation, they're triggered and poof, they're off and running. They do the toxic negative things. But when you have that awareness, to have the insight, mentally you interrupt. You're not protecting yourself. You're actually figuring out what's going on. The pause. Okay. Now, with that insight, you have the intellectual cognitive interruption, which gives you the possibility of leading to a behavioral interruption. You don't say the thing, fuck you back. You don't do the thing that's toxic or negative. Okay. So that gives you the pause part of it. Now, at that particular point, which is a very huge point in the process, that might be why people come to therapy, which is good. And they're also frustrated because at that point, they have enough awareness, they have enough insight. They're trying to interrupt, but they don't do a very good job of it. That's what the 3 E's are. The 3 E's are you start experimenting for something that's effective and efficient. You start experimenting with this behavior, or that vocalization, that verbalization that is effective, that works, and that's efficient, that works quickly. Now, what will happen, I would forewarn people, is that what will happen is you'll be aware and you'll have insight. And that's a huge step. But the next step is also huge, which is to actually interrupt your behavior, do it differently. And there'll be a time where you'll be aware enough to know you're being stupid, being toxic, being mean, being disrespectful, that it doesn't work, but you won't be able to stop yourself. You'll walk into the dark room backwards in the horror movie, you'll do it anyway. And that's really frustrating, but it's really good because that frustration is the beginning of experimenting for what's effective and efficient. And that's the problem solving of therapy. You try this, try that, do this, do that. Classic story. Stephen and Mary Beth have heard this before. The couple that I worked with, they said that they would get into an argument and they had progressed to the point where he knew that he needed to stop. So he would break off from the argument and she would say within 5 minutes, she would hear the vacuum cleaner in the living room. He'd be vacuuming in the living room. Was that perfect? He broke off, he interrupted, and metaphorically, he couldn't clean up the mess with her, but so he cleaned up the living room. That's kind of funny, that's kind of cute, but they stopped intensifying and getting worse and worse. So they were at the point of frustration. See, this is the part of the problem of social service and human services, is that sometimes people want to jump to intervention and change without stopping the negative behavior. As long as the negative behavior is still available, as long as the negative behavior is still habitual, learning a new behavior is not going to happen. So you have to stop the negative behavior first. Mary Beth and Stephen are in the Bay Area. In 1989, we have the Bay Bridge. Everybody was told, hey, don't crowd the bridge, take the subway, the BARTs underneath the water to San Francisco, take the ferry. People ignored it. And then 89, we had an earthquake and the bridge broke. You couldn't use the bridge anymore. And guess what? People started using the ferry. People started using the subway. Well, they always could, but until it was unavailable, did they look to see something new? When you say, I'm going to call the damn cops on you, I'm going to kick your ass out of the house, I am not going to be here, then continuing the negative behavior becomes unavailable. And then it becomes a possibility of growth and change. I'm going to file for divorce on you. That becomes the boundary that creates the possibility of change. Okay. So you break the cycle and you start experimenting. You also want to look at breaking negative cycles. You want to see if there's gender and power assumptions that create violent potential. The whole idea of owning your partner, being possessive, and so forth. And then you break the negative cycle by creating contracts of no harm and in a house, out of the house therapeutic separation. What you can and can't do inside the house, you allow each other to go to the bathroom, to your bedroom. You allow each other to go out of the house, things like that. You make deals. This is what we're going to do. When it gets crazy, we need to step away from each other. Deal? Either one of us can enforce it. One of my clients worked out between him and his wife something very simple. They have a code word. The code word is hamburger, or something like that. When it gets too crazy between the two of them, one of them says hamburger, and that means they have to break off, and they agree to that. And because of that, that's healthier for them. Let me pause for a second, give you guys a chance to give me some feedback. What are you hearing? What's making sense to you? What's resonating for you?
I'm really interested and curious what you saying about in the session with the couple going through the safety plan in front of the perpetrator. And maybe again, this is my naivety because I'm only learning couples therapy at the moment, but I suppose a part of me is thinking how that might empower the perpetrator to then take actions to prevent the person engaging in those safety behaviours, and so further empower the perpetrator.
That's interesting in a sense as you asked that, because there's a part of that is one of the reasons that you do need to do that. You might need to do the plan. I think you should do the plan in front of the perpetrator, and both of them, is that you need to show the perpetrator that you're not afraid. Usually the perpetrator, oftentimes if it's a narcissistic type perpetrator, paranoid type perpetrator, is violent, aggressive, and so forth, and they're intimidating, and the partner has been intimidated. And if the partner comes in there, if the couple comes in there and either or both of them experience you as a therapist as being intimidatable, you lose credibility. So it's actually the flip side of what you're talking about. It's just really important to assert, this is what's going to happen. But you also can deal with what you're just talking about using something like this. I do this as a general thing in a lot of the therapeutic processes, which is that I will work out with somebody what makes sense. We'll figure out what's going on. We'll work out how it happens, how they get triggered, and we'll work out different responses and better ways to do it. And then I say, and how will you screw this up? How will you mess this up? Because people mess things up. I'm not trying to eat too much junk. Well, how will I mess this up? Well, there'll be a party to go to. How will I? I'm going to cut back on my drinking. Well, at this Christmas party, someone's going to put a drink in my hand. Things like that, right? How will I overeat when I travel and I'm away from home and I'm lonely and I'm in a boring hotel room? Oh hell, I deserve to have some good food. I will mess it up that way. This is based on the premises that you ain't that smart as a therapist. They're clients, If they could just do what they're supposed to do, they would have done it already. But they usually also know how they sabotage them. So you do that. Now, in this particular session with the couple, so if you're worried about that, you do the whole thing, the plan itself. Well, how will this get messed up? Do you think your partner who has been abusive, do you think they'll follow through on this? Do you think they might manipulate this? How might they manipulate this? In other words, basically, you're doing a paradoxical intervention. And the paradoxical interventions, you're doing exploration and you're doing prediction. And the reason paradoxical interventions can work is that if you predict what's going to happen, then the person might resist the prediction and therefore change behavior, or they will do what you predict and that gets confirmed. You are a fucking asshole. And that's beneficial too.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Does that fit? Yeah. Yeah. So just be aware. And that big part of it is, especially with a narcissistic and controlling thing, is that you might be the one and only hope of somebody who's not going to be intimidated, who's going to be able to see this conceptual clarity, and they're going to question you, challenge you. They're going to try, or especially in the narcissistic personality, a lot of the domestic violence has narcissism involved in it, is that they'll either try to intimidate you, dominate you, control you, or they'll try to seduce you. They'll try to seduce you, and we're going to talk about that as well, who put themselves off as charming and convince you how their partner's wrong, crazy, and they're right, and that's absent and so forth. Stephen, got any thoughts about it? Because you said you're working with a couple, and so far, any triggering or resonate? Anything resonate?
I think the breaking the negative cycle, just that model is, at least in my experience, I've seen it play out. I think is rather accurate. And I do see where people get kind of stuck, individuals and within a couple kind of get stuck between, having the awareness and insight, and then, actually changing that behavior through, experimenting. And that experimenting kind of resonated with me, just because I see a lot of people trying to, like you said, jump to intervention or change without stopping these negative behaviors that I feel like kind of get lost in that that little part right there, between awareness, insight. They might have the insight, but without changing the behavior, which is kind of, I've noticed, can take more than just, sometimes cognitive reframing. Really takes like practice, and really can be a really ingrained thing. But I just, I think that really resonates for me beyond, couples.
Yeah, I think one of the key things there is that also, besides the insight, it's the deeper level insight, which is, why do I go ahead and keep on being stupid? I know I shouldn't do it. I know it's bad. That's where the psychological algebra is. Cultural part, the compulsive part, the addictive part, the trauma, attachment parts of it. So that's a deeper level of insight, is that I do this. This is reference something else, so this guy, he has affairs. He comes back, and he had a one night stand while he was out on a business trip, and I ran through him really deeply into his whole scenario in terms of leading up to going to this woman's apartment, woman's hotel room, and step by step by step by step. When did it go from being just friendly to being flirting? When did it went from flirting to being an offer? When did it go from availability? When did you? And then step by step by step by step, and finally in the parking lot, he says, that's when he knew that he was going to have sex with her. I said, how did you know? Because we were in the parking lot, and she was either going to go to her car and I was going to my car, and we were going to drive out to our respective hotel rooms. But then she looked at me, and I knew I was going to have sex with her, because if I knew that she would be disappointed if I didn't have sex with her. And then the question becomes, who was the first female you couldn't disappoint? And his answer, he burst into tears, this 45-year-old man, and it was his mother, because she would get disappointed, go into this dark, ugly, nasty depression, and the whole house would be consumed with gloom for about a month. So pleasing a woman, or not displeasing a woman, became it. The whole time he was at the bar talking to this woman, he knew that he might do something that he shouldn't do. But what made him do it anyway? This is a deeper level of insight. Mary Beth, got any thoughts resonating here?
No, I think what Stephen said about the interruption is really hitting me as an important piece to stopping the behavior. It definitely, a light bulb went off for me. I have a client that I think I'm missing that with the interruption. So it was really helpful to hear that again.
Anything to interrupt, and it's the first thing you want to look for. And you're going to have people who is really, really hard for them to interrupt. That's that the therapy becomes different because of so how do you get them to interrupt? And with them, it might be more focus, at least initially, on avoiding the triggers.
Two questions. One, when dealing with domestic violence, I heard you say that you would call the police. Now, from what I understand, and I don't, from what I know of domestic violence, that only the victim is able to really call and make the report, because even if you called, they come. So anyway, how does that work? And the second question would be, when you're dealing with somebody that is an abuser, your languaging of, being was a little bit confrontational with them. To what extent? I mean, I guess it's a lot of pulsing, knowing how long you've been working with them to know how far you can go, right? Because that would be, as a female, I would be a little intimidated, if this guy was an abuser, and I wouldn't want to create anything there in front of me that I wouldn't be able to handle.
The first thing is saying that I will call the police. I would call the police, is that I will do that. And legally and ethically, the police might not take my report. But see, one of the principles there is that people who are violent, people who are out of control that way, most people do it in isolation. Most people compartmentalize it so that at work, they don't know what they do at home. Other members of the family don't know what they do, So this is why it's so rare. Sometimes it's rare for them to even come to therapy because they're exposing themselves, and so calling on that. And so there's a part of it which is a therapeutic show in some ways, a posturing, and they may or may not be really affected by it, but I'll put it out there as unacceptable. But maybe the more important principle is that for the person who's being victimized, they hear that. They hear that you will intervene, that you will do something about it. The other side of it, as far as like how much you were willing to risk and how to develop the skills, well, that's why the calligraphy is back there is for learning is study and practice. You're going to find out that you can do it by practicing. You can find out how much you can handle by doing it. You're not going to find out how far you can go, and what skills you need to have, and what language you need to have without the practice part of it. So you go and do it. Rosa, one of the other MFT Wiser persons, we talked about this, and she's a woman, and she says, she's really assertive too. She'll go for it too. Which is one of the reasons I really like her, because she'll go for it too, and see, and that's where it's important to practice that assertiveness, because you get it. Was I that assertive and that confident when I was a new therapist? No, I wasn't. How did I get more assertive and confident? Practice, being willing to do it, and yeah, that can be difficult. That's why your own process and getting consultation, supervision is so important, because you need to do enough of your own therapeutic process so you can do their therapy, not your therapy. Because if you're protecting yourself in that situation and your comfort level, rather than trying to do for the client, it's not going to serve them. It's very real. Like, yeah, I'm a man, but I'm also a 5'9" dude, medium build. At my heaviest, I was 180, 175 for a long time. I weigh less now because I'm not eating during the quarantine. I have this verbally abusive guy in therapy with his 5 foot, barely 100-pound wife, and he is about 6'2", 220 pounds, and he is raging at her. And I confront the hell out of him. I confront him. I yell at him. I invoke his ideal self. And this conception, the way it worked was that he was yelling at his wife, and she was just trembling. And I said to him, so what the hell are you doing? What is this bullshit? Here you are, 6'2", 220 pounds, and you're yelling at your itty bitty little wife, terrorizing her. Is that the kind of man you want to be? Is that the kind of man you want to be? Invoking his ideal self. Is that the kind of husband you want to be? You think that's right? That if you get pissed off, that you yell and scream and terrorize your wife? You see her over there trembling. What kind of bullshit is that? He's younger than me, bigger than me, hell angrier than me, and I do it. And this is also practice. And then there's the cold narcissistic types who do the superiority thing, do the intimidating. Again, it's practice as well. There are factors. When you mention as a woman, I'm also 67. I'm older too. how much of that, and this is a personal process, how much of that qualifications about safety is about being a woman, being a man, being a person of color, being older, or how much of that is our internalized power or lack of power because of what society says about us as of any of those things. So it's a good question, but again, it's still practice. That's the only way you can really learn how to figure out how to do that is to practice it. I'm gonna bump you back to Mary Beth. You're kind of nodding and like did something else kind of being in your head when we were talking about that?
I laugh because nothing slipped past you, Ronald. No, it was just I think you said something about you have to do your own work in order to do the work. And I had to have like a sort of a come to Jesus moment with a client this week. Meaning that I had to like sort of I had to confront something that was going on. And I was really nervous, but I knew that I had to do it. And I was nervous going into it. And then once I did it, I was like, oh, like that was my shit going into it. But like I had to acknowledge what was mine and what was theirs. And it was helpful therapeutically. Like I think that it changed a dynamic in our relationship that's going to be helpful going forward. But I also recognized that my nervousness about having the conversation, that's something that I like, there's something for me to personally work on. But if I let that get into the way, and if I think that something's nervous, like if I'm nervous about something, it means it's probably the right action to take with the client because it's my shit too. So
right.
Just sort of, yeah.
The learning part of it is the more practice, the more you do it, the less it becomes, I feel this, I sense this, should I do it? The more it becomes, oh, hell yeah, I'm going to do it. But how? How to do it well, how to do it therapeutically, how to clean it up, So it becomes clearer and clearer. So like, just even Melvi, you asked that question, which is, it is hard, it is difficult, it is challenging. So, but if that becomes, I see that I need to do it, then it's figure out how to do it. That is the practice learning part of confronting. Because the idea of, oh yeah, that you need to confront somebody who's abusive, of course you need to confront them. You need to hold them accountable, responsible for their toxic behavior. Of course you need to do that. How do you do that? So it takes practice. And that's where the personal process is that, I always joke about, you got to do enough of your own therapeutic process so that you're in a session and you're not doing your therapy instead of their therapy, Now, of course, you being who you are, of course you're in it, but it's like, doing as well as possible.
No, on that note, Ronald, I think you there's something that you always say that has been really helpful, and that is like what your process is with your like with when you get triggered in a session, what you do, and like how you're like I've used that so much, and because like it's interesting how like your shit can come up in the sessions, and so having you like you say the piece about like that you acknowledge the trigger and then you move on is really powerful and like very, it resonated a lot with me.
Right. Well, it's for that version of so many times I tell clients, you're supposed to be anxious. You're supposed to be depressed. If you're not anxious or depressed, you're smoking too much pot. You're supposed to be, and that's normal. And pain is a signal as well. So if you spend all this energy trying not to be what you are, it ain't going to work for you. It's going to backfire on you. So accept who you are, and then okay, I'm anxious, so I should be anxious. That makes sense. So now I'll deal with managing my anxiety as opposed to being mad at myself or frustrated with myself about, just like I am what I am. I am who I am. And that also fits into, the idea of doing therapy where you the person is the therapist as opposed to that you're some a conductor in some therapy process that doesn't have to do with you, because you are who you are. You do your work. That's what you do. Come back around. Melvi, did we address that decently, or
No,
how's
yes,
your hope that's helpful?
it is. Thank you.
Okay. This whole abuse bully victim dynamics, okay? In the workshop or the training I've done, or the book I've done about how dangerous is this client, aggressive behavior, abuse of hurtful behavior, violent behavior, bullying behavior is actually on a low is lower in a hierarchy or continuum of abuse, because there's some more severe forms. So just in other words, bully victim dynamics. Certainly the gender stuff allows for a so-called benevolent patriarchy that empowers bully behavior, you know. Um, um, and there's also different cultural aspects of different class and caste experiences and so forth, that you're entitled to do that. Classically, parents bully their kids or be obnoxious and negative, but if the kids call them on it, they're being uppity and disrespectful. So there's some power dynamics there. Now, one of the things about bullying is here's a term. It's called hostile attributional bias. Hostile attributional bias. Basically, you attribute to the other person that they're being hostile. Say they're being hostile. In other words, they're the ones who's attacking you. And because you do that, then that creates the entitlement to go screw you back. So hostile attributional bias, that's being anxious. That's beyond sensitivity to hypersensitivity, beyond vigilance to hypervigilance, moving toward paranoia, that this person's after you. Now, where does that come from? Where does that come from? And that's again the insight. Now, there's something called a reactive bully. A reactive bully, some people consider the most dangerous type of bully, because there are the alpha bullies. The alpha bullies bully, and they're effective in their bullying. In essence, they bully and they get power and they get control out of it. But there's something called the reactive bully, also known as the bully / victim, or the ineffective bully. In other words, they have bullying behavior, but they have the victim identity. And they tend to be actually the most dangerous and abusive type people, because where the alpha bully will bully and get power and control out of it, that they otherwise won't bully if they can't get power and control, but they get sufficient power and control from the bullying. And when there's not a bullying situation, they can let it go. But the reactive bully always feels justified, doesn't see themselves negatively, but they feel like they're victimized. And as they're victimized, they're entitled. The reactive bully is more likely to abuse children, much more likely to do intimate partner violence. Okay. And there's that entitlement stuff again, and that victimhood stuff. Okay. Now, the problem with someone who's a reactive bully is that if you're a bully type, who are you going to hang out with except other bullies, right? But if you're not an alpha bully and you hang with other bullies, guess what the other bullies are going to do to you? They're going to bully you. So you seek out. You cannot hang with the cool kids. You cannot hang with the victims because you despise them, because you despise that in yourself. So you can only hang out with the other bullies, but you're not an alpha bully. So you can get picked on by them, or you're going to do aggressive behaviors and words, and then when the alphas catch you doing that, they'll jump on you and intimidate you. You go, oh no, come on, I'm just kidding. So what happens to them? They have the behavioral and life consequences of bullies, and the emotional and psychological damages of the victim, and thus they're more likely to be acting out, violent and abusive. Okay.
Ronald, I'm having a hard time conceptualizing that. Could you give an example?
Let's take a kid with a learning disability. Okay. Let's take a kid with a learning disability, because they have a learning disability, they're going to have trouble academically. So they don't feel successful academically. And maybe it's not diagnosed, maybe it's not supported. So they're not going to get the academic accolades, self-esteem from that. Okay, but they're not owning it. So they feel stupid. But as they feel stupid, they want to feel more powerful. So they'll pick on the other kids. But as they pick on the other kids, the other kids won't like them. They'll get in trouble. So he is going to hang out with the other bullies. But when he's hanging out with the other bullies, the alpha bully. Okay, so let's look at the Mean Girl movies. The Mean Girls are the alphas. They're actually bullying and getting status from being the bullies, and they got the hanger-oners. The hanger-oners who get picked on by the mean girls because they can't really hang with the victims. They got to associate with the powerful ones, but they don't have that much power, that much status, so they get teased. People talk about their hair and so forth. So whereas if somebody's purely a victim, they're going to hang out, maybe find some other kids who are victimized as well, and they're going to be the nerds hanging out together, and they're going to take care of each other.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
In the labor world where you're involved in, you saw people like this, right? Who were marginally functional, socially inept, but aggressive, maybe negative with other people, and they get in trouble, and they claim that it's everybody else's fault. They're getting picked on. The union's not taking care of them. The company is fucking them over. But they're like, it's like, shit, I'd fire you too if I could. Right? Yeah.
Somebody's coming into mind. I get it. Yes. I know. I've worked with, I've worked with a few of those folks. So
see, this is the best thing. All these diagnoses, descriptions and stuff, when you can relate it to somebody you've actually known and met, then it comes alive to you. Yeah, so and so. One of my I might have mentioned this before. Gregory Lesser does things on personality disorders. He gave a list of movie and TV characters with different characteristics. And from Seinfeld, he says, Jerry Seinfeld in the Seinfeld TV show, obsessive compulsive personality disorder, not OCD, because he's not anxious, but he likes things neat and orderly. And he gets comfort from it. Felix Unger in The Odd Couple, obsessive compulsive personality disorder. He likes things neat and orderly. Makes him calm. OCD is, no, that's different. But then my favorite thing from that, he says, because I always had trouble understanding schizotypal personality disorder. He says Kramer on Seinfeld, schizotypal. Wildly creative, kind of erratic, kind of manic, but in his own way, kind of brilliant, gifted, but all over the place, with these wild associations. So as soon as you can associate with somebody, borderline personality disorder, I mentioned this, Uma Thurman in My Super Ex-Girlfriend, where she goes nuts on one of the Owen Wilson brothers in terms of she's borderline, and when he breaks up with her, she punishes him by throwing a shark into his bedroom while he's having sex with his other woman. It's ridiculous, but it's like, oh, that's borderline behavior. There you go. And then there's any number of narcissists, are presented. Kevin Spacey and Robin Wright, both narcissists in that show, House of Cards, House of Lies, whatever that was. Yeah. So the bully characteristics. Okay, so what happens is that bullies experience aggression as working. The short-term outcomes causes them to bond with other people. This is where you're going to get some guys who are going to go at the bar and they're going to bitch about their wives. They're going to talk shit together about how their wives and girlfriends are doing them wrong and how you got to control them and everything else, because you can find like-minded people. Okay, so social norms can reinforce it. So the victim characteristics, being depressed, being a victim. Now, this is the delicacy of working with somebody who's been victimized and bullied, is that how do you hold them accountable and responsible Because if their stance is that they're victimized, their stance is that they have no power. But then therapy is about empowering people. So how do you empower? So the question is, if they're the biggest asshole in the world, how come you picked them? How come you kept them? How come you didn't kick them out in their ass after the second date when they did that thing? And then some people are really reactive because they say that sounds like you're making it the victim's fault, as opposed to how come is not a rhetorical how come that you should have broken up with this person or caught it early on. It's how come in a real sense. How come? And my metaphor always is, how come you ran the flashing red light? How come you ignored the cue? What was it that was so compelling that you missed out on something, that you missed out on the warning sign? And after the warning signs replicated themselves the second time and third time, how come you didn't leave then? Stop it off then. And that's a real question. And the real question, because the answer could be because of culture, because of self-esteem issues, because of some kind of attachment or trauma issues and so forth. That's how come. Which means we can deal with those things and then work through it. But is see, holding somebody accountable, because holding somebody accountable is not the same as blaming them, and empowering them isn't. But to empower anybody, they have to take responsibility. So this is the delicacy of the dynamic. This is the therapeutic skill to figure out how to help somebody. It says, and the classic is that you picked them. How come? And I always remember it was one woman divorced, and it says, well, how come you kept him? It says, well, because he changed. She does hand motions. He changed. I said, come on, he didn't change. When did you first see something, that he didn't change? And then after a lot of work, on the second day, she saw stuff that bothered her, but she continued. And then we looked at why she continued, and there were reasons why she continued, but she actually did see it. This is why I call it running the flashing red light. The yield sign. You actually did see the cues, but you minimized them. You tried to ignore them. You explained them. You accepted bullshit, and there's a reason for that. There's a reason I go to that place and overeat. Like, we're not having Thanksgiving with the family, so we're not even going to have turkey. We're going to order Chinese food. So we're ordering way too much food. I know we're ordering way too much food. But why is that? Because Thanksgiving is not just family time and turkey, it's overeating time. So that's not good, but I know it. So I took a couple of things off the menu, but still only a couple of things because I get it, So when so there's a flashing red light there that says, okay, I'm choosing purposely to ignore it. But other times it's like I BS myself. And why do you BS yourself? Because you're desperate for attachment. Somebody said that my girlfriend's changed. I'm gonna give her another chance. I go, why? Well, because I know she can change. I says, why do you know she can change? Because I know she can change. I said, what new experience have you had with her to give you a reason to hope that she can change? And he admitted that there wasn't anything new. So then we said, well, that's not real hope, that's false hope. So what is that about then? That's about not wanting to start all over. That's about not wanting to be alone. In other words, why he's running the red light. That makes sense. Which you got to learn how to be alone without being lonely. Learn how to be lonely without getting desperate. Learn how to be desperate without making bad choices, being stupid. So there's probably some attachment stuff going on here when you look at that. So it's not to victimize and blame, but it's hold them accountable. Because if you get a client who, you will get this. You will get clients who come in and they will do the victim thing. They'll assert how they're victimized. And you give them all the empathy in the world, but there's a point you're going to get sick of them being a victim because your job is to empower them. So they come in week after week after week telling you how miserable their life is, how miserable their relationships. You're going to get sick of them. You're going to start losing empathy for them because they're going to make you feel unfulfilled. Unless you're some kind of unless you better do some personal work, because that's pretty unhealthy that you like victims. But then what's that about too? Very challenging in terms of changing that dynamic. Okay, boundaries. So the boundaries and consequences are first, and that's why even that first dialogue interaction with about, is there violence, what kind of violence is, here's the boundaries, here are the consequences. Okay, now the thing about boundaries and consequences is boundaries and consequences are behavioral. They do the safety stuff, the risk reduction. Boundaries and consequences are not about internal change. Boundaries and consequences come first. Like I said, until the bridge broke, people were still driving across the bridge. So the internal change. Some people are wearing masks now, not because they want to. Some people aren't still wearing masks, but is there an internal change? Is that suddenly you're this more conscientious person, or you're going to get in trouble or whatever else? In other words, it's not to change internally, but to block the aggressive behavior. Block the person's aggressive behavior and block your own availability for it. Only the partner can enforce the boundaries. So I use this metaphor all the time about you could build the castle wall. You could build a castle. Why the hell I got to build a castle? Because there's barbarians out there. I got a perpetrator partner. That's why I got to do it. Okay, but once you build the walls and say you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't come in here, you think they're going to come, the barbarians will come up to the castle and go, oh, nice walls. I guess we'll stay outside. No, they're going to attack. Why? Because they're barbarians. You set a boundary with your partner who's abusive. You think they're going to suddenly stop being abusive? No, that's what they do. So when you set a boundary, there has to be consequences. In other words, you have to be willing to follow through. So that's going to be part of the work. Because if the therapy is, well, I want my partner to do this, I want to set these boundaries, then the question is, are you going to be able to enforce these boundaries? Follow through with consequences, which is leaving the house, filing for divorce, calling the cops, things like that. Otherwise, there's so much blah, 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 blah. So many times, where it's not necessarily physical violence, but emotional violence or behavior that's just problematic. I said, so why do you let them do this? I don't let them do this. I tell them I tell them it's not okay. Yeah, and then you have 3 babies with them. I told them, I said, it's not okay. And then you stayed in the house. Unless you do a consequence, it's blah, 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 blah. It's not real. Now, why don't you do the consequence? That's another part of therapy. This is why some people purposely do not set boundaries, because they know if they set a boundary, it's meaningless unless they enforce the boundary, and they're too scared to enforce the boundary. What Melvie brought up in question about, dealing with an aggressive person and setting those boundaries is very, very relevant, because Melvie knows that to set the boundary, she also has to enforce the boundary. There's going to be some kind of argument, battle, pushback of some sort, and being able and being ready to do that. There are so many people, there are a lot of therapists, they don't ask the questions about domestic violence. They don't ask the questions about child abuse because they don't want to have to set the boundary, which they're legally obligated to, especially in terms of child abuse, to follow through on. They'll say, did that really happen? Was it just this or that? In other words, give people an escape route to avoid, they don't ask the questions, especially with child abuse. Boundaries are meaningless without consequences. Consequences mean you need to follow through. And then you'll also follow through consistently. If you work with domestic violence or emotional violence of some sort, and they say, well, I told him I don't like that. I told him to stop. And then what? And then you had another baby with them. You told them that, that they can't drink like that. It's not safe, and you don't want to be around them. And then what did you do? You went on another date with them. That they said they're sorry. And then they did it again. You know that the whole old process, one strike, 2 strikes, 3 strikes, you're out. How many times have you given somebody 1 strike, given them a second chance? Okay, but how many times you give them a second? They got 1 strike, a second strike, that you even bother with the 3rd strike, knowing that they're going to strike out 3rd time. But you're talking about people who give over and over and over. So the rhetorical question I ask him says, so how many times do you need to get kicked in the head before you're willing to follow through? But I told him, yeah, blah, 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 you know. So now, if somebody says, what am I supposed to do? Then they're doing helplessness, okay? And then you deal with that, the helplessness, you know, as a victim stance. Okay, now, ironically, sometimes you could have a two-victim couple. In other words, they beat up on each other. They might beat up each other physically, but more commonly in couples therapy or non-physical violence therapy, you could have a couple where one person is emotionally abusive and hurtful to the other, or sometimes you have a couple where they're doing it to each other. Ironically, that actually might be easier to work with, because you're dealing with the same issues with both of them: the entitlement, the hurt, and helping them process all this. Aggressive men may be more sensitive to themes of abandonment, which might have to do with insecure attachment. Impulsive offenders scored high in anger were insecure and fearful in their relationships. In other words, they were anticipating being rejected, being angry. And their violence may be driven by anger in the context of their attachment. Attachment being, so this is something, one of the better trainings I had relatively new after I got licensed, was a whole thing about domestic violence having to do with insecure attachment. Men who have insecure attachment, who don't know how to express it. Women, culturally speaking, tend to be more trained in terms of dealing with loss, abandonment, and so forth. And there's mechanisms that they get guided to or supported to go through. Whereas men, we get drunk, we watch violent sports, we get into a fight. So when you're broken up with somebody, then how do you handle it? And you handle it, unfortunately, sometimes by being violent. What I call it, remember the Viking theory of couples relationships, which is that there's one theory that says men and women historically, long time ago, had relatively egalitarian relationships because even as a couple, and much less a village or a group, that people had to cooperate in order to survive. So yeah, there were differences in terms of actually, bearing children and physical differences, the physiology, but you still need to cooperate. And then what happened? Along comes like the Vikings, the marauders, and the safety of the family, the safety of the village, of each other, depended on having men who could fight off the warriors, these marauders. Whereupon men needed to be more brutes, which also in order to be brutes, they also need to be able to detach from a lot of the gentler emotional feelings. So in detaching from the gentler emotional feelings, they were still allowed to love their family, love their partners, allowed to be angry, because anger serves allowing them to be violent. Anger, violence, and love. Anger, violence, and love, but not so much the gentle feelings, because when you're fighting off the Vikings, it's not a good time to be gentle and empathetic, right? So you got to be love, anger, and violence. Love, anger, and violence. What is love, anger, and violence? Love, anger, and violence becomes a perfect formula for domestic violence, because the person you love, for whatever reason, you feel abandoned or rejected or betrayed by them, and then rather than be able to be sad, be hurt, have fear, and then work it through to problem solve it, you go to anger, and violence becomes the way you solve it. And you get men especially who beat and even kill their girlfriends and wives, who will swear up and down without any deception how much they love their partners, and they do. However, they don't know how to handle abandonment or rejection. And in any kind of love relationship, those things are going to happen. So that's from an attachment perspective, which I think is very powerful and very relevant. And that is one of the types of domestic violence therapy that might be amenable to couples therapy, because it's attachment based. The other ones that are more with narcissism, sociopathy, paranoia, even though you could rate those to attachment theories, this type of insecure attachment might be amenable. There's instrumental offenders. Instrumental offenders, basically, they offend as an instrument. Their violence is a way to control. Now, they're dominant and they're not driven by anger, they're driven more by control. Those people aren't going to be as amenable to couples therapy, domestic violence therapy. Let's see. Associative mating. Sometimes people pair up with other narcissists, particularly. Sometimes people pair up with people with personality, as well. Attachment, love, and not love. It ain't love, man. It's attachment desperation. Stephen, you worked through middle school kids, right? Yeah. You see some of those kids, they're in love with each other. They're desperately in love with each other. And then they're crushed on Friday because they broke up with the love of their life. By Monday, they got a new squeeze and they're in love again. But they find another one just like that because they're desperate to have somebody. That's attachment desperation, more than attachment anxiety. So that's a very profound, way to look at. So preoccupied attachment, negative view of self, positive view of others, characterized by low self-worth, excessive dependency on others' loves. In other words, unless I get someone to love me, I'm not okay. And I really need them to love me, be close to me, approve of me, be totally involved with me. I get totally involved in. This is the kid or the person who texts you all the time. I know everything you're doing. Can't stand that you're doing anything with anybody else. Doesn't even be with somebody who's potentially a partner. It could be your family, whatever else, and they can become violent, because reactive, because they feel rejected. But they're also more accepting of abuse because they're so desperate to have somebody. They'll tolerate being abused because they got to have somebody. So there's also a dismissing pattern. Okay, so there's preoccupied attachment, negative view of self, positive view of others. There's a dismissing pattern, a positive view of self, but negative about others. So it's compulsive self-reliance, downplays how other people are important, dismissive of them. And the dismissing and the ignoring might be their form of violence. Because if I harass you, if I say negative things to you, there's a you there, you. If I ignore you, you don't exist. And that might be, and someone like that can be very powerful. Melvie, when you talk about somebody who might be dominating and so forth and confronting them, some people may not be overtly, they might sound otherwise very cool and professional, but what they'll do is they'll kill the therapy. They'll ghost you. They'll just call back or leave a message that they decide to work with somebody else, because you weren't intimidatable or you weren't seducible, and because of that, they annihilate you. I've been ambushed a few times by that in couples therapy. One in particular, the couple came in. He was so into it. He was into it. I was validating him. There's a lot of stuff that he thought he wanted to talk about that he felt was a problem. And he was so happy, he seemed to be reconnecting with him. And what I missed was that his girlfriend was not liking it, that I was validating him and hearing him. So, and not, playing up that she was right and he was wrong. And boom, before the night was done, she called back and killed therapy. She didn't do it in person. She did it, she found some excuse to kill therapy, So overt aggressiveness, but that was her aggressive in her professional, nice way.
Ronald, I have a question.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have time.
Please.
So when working with couples, there's so much, going back to boundaries. Boundaries have so much to do with a lot of self-worth issues and a lot of these things do. So how deep do you go when you have two people? I mean, if somebody goes to therapy to, for themselves and you're working one-on-one, that seems more like you can go down to that depth. When you're working with couples, how does that play out?
See, my particular take on couples therapy is that individual work is sometimes done best in couples therapy. The reason being is that individual processes and issues, if you got problems or issues, where do they manifest? In relationships more than any other place. And if I'm working with a couple, you and your partner, and I'm working with you because there's, like I said, there's the x plus 1 plus 1 plus 1. What's that x that causes it to be compulsive, everything else? And I'm working with you and I help you figure that out. First of all, that you figure that out, and we help you figure that out, that can be amazingly therapeutic and powerful. And for your partner to witness that can be also amazingly therapeutic and powerful, in that your partner sits there and goes, "Oh my goodness, I thought she was just being nasty to me. I thought he just didn't care. You mean this is actually about the trauma from their childhood? It's not just about me, you know."
Oh, powerful.
And that gives each other the chance to have UCI, UCA, UCA. Understanding is the understanding part of it. That's insight. C, then compassion. The understanding leads to the compassion, leads to the A, which leads to acceptance. That's why they do that. There's a reason for this. And so I will do that in couples therapy. And the idea that you send, see, I think there's I understand the theory and the practice, but the idea that you work with a couple and somebody has so much crap going on that you better go do your own therapy before and then come back. Well, their stuff gets expressed in the relationship more than any other place. They don't have attachment stuff by themselves. They don't have trauma stuff and just traumatize on their own. They traumatize with an intimate partner, with a family, at the workplace, in relationships. And who's more invested that you do well, and who benefits or is harmed by you not doing well, but your partner. So the answer to your question is that I go as deep as necessary and deep as I can in doing individual work in couples therapy, which means sometimes in a couples therapy, it's all about this one person's process. And then I look at the other person sometimes. I'll give you an example. This guy, he's an entrepreneur. And he's always trying to create businesses for himself and all this stuff. And he finds it so exciting, so stimulating. And then his wife is more conservative. So I ask her about this whole creative, taking risk stuff. And we do the work and we go depth in her life. And basically, as a child, it was dangerous as hell to take risks. It was dangerous to put out anything because the father or the mother would find your rage. The safest thing to do was to be as compliant as possible, be as conservative as possible, to take no risk. So did you have experience in taking risks, being an entrepreneur, things like that? He says, no. What would that have been? That would have been so dangerous for me. And then I looked over at him because now he understood this. And I said, what do you think? Did you know this about her? And he actually gets tears in his eyes and says, I really didn't understand this. I knew that she didn't understand me. And I get so much joy and fulfillment out of this. And that's just really awful that she can't get this, that she doesn't have this ability to experience this. It just makes me so sad. And then I looked over at her and I said, how do you do? And she goes, he did really good. He did really good because she expressed herself in her individual process. He heard it, related to it, understanding, compassion, acceptance, and that deepened their rapport and their connection and so forth. So I think it's amazing sometimes to do that. And I don't know if she could have done that in isolation, or if she had done it in isolation, I don't know if she could have presented it with him otherwise. Because even if he does, got to present it back to each other and interact and activate it. So, yeah, that's my take. Not everybody does that, but
No,
I think it's like, and a lot of times people are crazy or screwed up and have all these problems. And when do they finally go to therapy about it? When it's messing up their intimate relationships. It's the best opportunity. And you could be in so much denial about your process, but when you're about to you're damaging and about to lose your most intimate partnership, then the odds, the reason, the motivation to do it becomes really powerful. Yeah, individual stuff, I totally think it's great. Sometimes, on rare occasions, I have separated people and sent them to individual therapy. I've also done couples therapy occasionally where I work with one person separately and another person separately. And then at some point do the couples therapy because they're so out of control with each other. I can't get anything done. It depends. Your call. So being regarding attachment, really rejection sensitive. BAR, betrayal, abandonment, rejection. Betrayal, abandonment, rejection. BAR. The simple mnemonic to remember that everybody has issues with betrayal, abandonment, rejection. Betrayal is that we have a contract and agreement between me and an intimate partner about what we're supposed to do, how we're supposed to be for each other. Abandonment, terrified that I'll be abandoned. Rejected, that my thoughts and feelings will be rejected. So what's the reverse of those things? The reverse of those things is following through and being consistent with the agreements, the contract of relationship. Rather than abandonment is that always be available or to come back and reject. What's the opposite of rejection? Acceptance. Acceptance of this is how you feel, this is what you think, which you could disagree on issues, but then you accept the person. So BAR is a guidance to looking at what the issues are, but then the flip side of all those are the guidance to what you're trying to achieve in therapy. And when people feel abandoned, betrayed, or rejected, then that's where the emotional striking out, lashing out can happen. But you could also have traumatic bonding because of that as well. So with insecure attachment, men low on anxiety over abandonment and high trait anger have the highest likelihood of intimate physical violence. Why? They're not afraid. They don't have anxiety over abandonment, but they're highly angry. So they're more likely to be violent. One of the reasons why is that they're likely to go to the code calculating place. And they're not afraid of punishing, hurting the other person, being rejected per se. So it's more like the anger entitles them to hurt the other person back. Men with low anxiety and low anger are more likely to be physically violent to a partner as well. No, say low anger control. Okay. Basically, they when they're hurt, then they lash out. Social information processing. Okay, what it must mean, but what it might mean. Okay, so a lot of times a client will say, this is what it is, which is with the premise, the assertion is this is what it must mean. She didn't call. That must mean she doesn't love me. He spent the extra day on the business trip. It must mean he's not having an affair. They didn't come back on time. They didn't do this for me. It must mean they don't love me anymore or they don't respect me. And that absoluteness, basically, those are doom statements. Must mean, if you could change that to it might mean. It must mean, it might mean. Never or all the time. Those are doom statements. Always, never, which is different than too much, not often enough. Because when you, and if the assertion it must mean never or always, then they present a fatal, doomsday presentation. If you could get them to go, it might mean, or it happens too much, which is that, what is that? So you ask, what does it mean to you? How does that make you feel or think? What does it mean to you? Which implies what? It can have other meanings. What does it make you think or feel? Which also implies that you can think or feel something else. What did you do then? Basically, it must mean this. I'm hurt, therefore I must do that. However, if it doesn't mean that, it might mean something else. Then instead of doing that, you could explore what it does mean. What might it mean? It must mean this. I'm hurt, It must mean you're disrespecting me, you're not caring about me. I'm hurt. I must lock you out. I must hurt you back. And then the question is, well, how does that work? What's the consequence of it? Okay. And it's a simple question is, how does that work? And does it make it better or does it make it worse? Sometimes people will say it must mean, which gives them the entitlement to do this behavior. Okay. And then it says, okay, if it must mean that, and that you're entitled to do this, then the question is, how's that working? Does that make the relationship better or does it make it worse? And then when they say it makes it worse, okay, then you go, okay, I'm not going to even talk to you about whether it's right or wrong. I'm going to talk to you about it doesn't work. Are you interested in something that might work better? And they say, well, nothing works. I've tried everything, nothing works. Well, then you're screwed. Why are you bothering coming to therapy? In other words, you join them in their doom and confront them because they really still are hopeful. The functionality interpretations are addressed. It's like, so what's the decoding? The perception, the attention, interpretation. Then from that, there's some decision making. So what are the possible responses? Choose a response. It's interesting. This kid I worked with who has he's at Aspergian autistic spectrum. He gets caught up on this is what it must mean, and this is what he must do. And I told him, whenever you think it must mean something, I want you to train yourself to think what else might it mean? And when you think this is what I must do, I want you to train yourself to think what might you do differently? Because when people get stuck in the absolute part, it's a tunnel into disaster because it doesn't work. So check the motivational accuracy. Okay. In this particular case, say with Madeline and Dirk characters, Dirk believes that Madeline's motivation is to control him, for example. So you get that out of him, and then you ask Madeline, so do you want to control him? What do you get out of controlling? Does that make sense to you? What does she get out of controlling? You check the motivation, and her motivation, she might say, no, I'm just trying to get his attention. Oh, how well does that work? By the way, do you give her attention? How well does that work? Part of it is also this empathetic accuracy. Part of it is all this processing is that we do assumptions. Assume, right? Make an ass out of you and me. Assume. How accurate are you? And this is so a lot of times I'll ask a client something and they'll say this and everything. I go, what do you think about what they just said? Basically, I'm just checking with them. Does that fit? Does that make sense to you? Especially when there's interpretation, because you get to own your own sense of self. And sometimes you misinterpret. So how accurate are you in terms of empathizing? And if you're inaccurate, what's that about? Is that because of previous traumas? Is that because of a previous abuse, cultural stuff, and so forth? Okay. Verbal fluency. Verbal fluency is a big one. In the research I did about bullying, it was really interesting. It said that boys who tended to be bigger tended to be the bullies. But it actually turned out that boys who were bigger, a lot of them weren't the bullies. What they had was social fluency. The boys that were aggressive and bullying, they didn't have social fluency. In other words, their ability to communicate was by domination, intimidation, and hurting other people. But the other boys in the study who were actually big as well, they had social fluency. And the social fluency meant that they were able to negotiate the social interactions. And they redefined that as not just social fluency, but verbal fluency. In other words, they knew how to talk and communicate. So the boy who was the bully would snatch the ball and try to control everything. And the boy who had social fluency would say, hey, you be the captain of one team, I'll be the captain of the other team. You choose first, and then I get to choose, and then we can play this game. In other words, they'd use their verbal ability to negotiate the process. This is why in couples therapy, a lot of times you are providing language. You're providing language. You're providing someone like Dirk, who might be your classic stoic, hard-headed, aggressive male, emotional language to express his needs for attachment, fear of abandonment. You might be training Madeline verbal fluency in order to express her emotional needs and her boundaries in a way that will resonate with Dirk. In other words, get her express herself well. So you model language. When I'm doing these things, when I'm talking a lot and giving examples and stuff, I'm modeling language, which you can steal and use in therapy. You know, I steal from all kinds of people. I hear something, that's good stuff. I'm gonna use that. I'm gonna copy that, you know. So it's a therapeutic verbal fluency. But then when you offer it to them, you know, you prompt them to say this, you know. So, and that's where I got my fruit bowl down there, right? Verbal fluency is not about the facts. A bowl is just a bowl. And what's important about a bowl is a bowl is a container. What does it hold? It holds something that's supposed to be fruitful. It actually holds an emotional request, and the emotional request simply is for you to care. The car was dirty, and it didn't have gas. So that's just the facts. Now, sometimes it's just the facts, but sometimes it's an emotional request. I want you to care that it was dirty and that I had to take extra time to scramble to go pick up my mom. And I want you to care that I had to scramble. Verbal fluency, actually including empathetic accuracy, is being able to say, "Oh, I'm sorry. Uh, that was kind of stressful. You had to rush, huh? Bummer. I messed up. Sorry. Now I'm an asshole." But speaking to that and having the words to do that, and some people aren't trained to do that. Actually, any thoughts? Mary Beth, Rachel, Mel,
I'm good.
Melvi, any thoughts? Think resonate in terms of the attachment stuff and especially the verbal fluency part of it. Learning how to talk, you know, emotions. So there might be a duality, kind of simplistic duality of what we do as therapists. You know, on the one hand, we try to help people understand insight, insight. You know, cognitive behavioral type stuff, insight oriented, make things logical and so forth. And the other one is that we're trying to train language, communication, interactions, and so forth. I mean, there's more to it than that. That's kind of simplistic, but emotional language.
Ronald, I think that's super important. Is there anybody that you can recommend to read or to follow on that?
Emotional language. I think emotional focus therapy, EFT, probably has like that. Rogerian, therapy. But also like this next part we're gonna get into is like how to the types and patterns. The book that a lot of people like is one was about love languages. You know that some people express love by acts of kindness, other people express love by gifts. Things like that. You know, but they depend on your background and so forth. So part of it is that translation, the articulation. That's why like that little story I told about how you know that your husband who's not speaking to you when you're emotionally uh, upset, you find that abandonment, but that's actually a message of love on his part because he doesn't want to get into the anger and become toxic and scary. That's actually an act of love. That's a translation, you know. So part of it is even asking the question: when you do that, what does that mean? When they do that, what does it mean to you? Um, I always use this analogy. This comparison is I had a cat once, and the cat liked this. So one day he left a headless rat on the porch. That was his gift to us, you know. And I've had people tell me that they've had dead mice left on their pillow in their bed from their cat. Because that's how cats love you. you know. And that's kind of like a classic translation, like the patriarchal male pattern of loving the family is what? Being the good provider. And then there's food, feeding people, so there's like this. So sometimes there's stuff you could read about that, but sometimes it's not what you read and what you know, but asking the question, how do you show that you care? When they do that, what do you think their intention is? What does that mean to you? And the classic thing is, of course, parents who spank their kids say it's because I love you, care for you. The boundaries is because I love you. Yeah. Yeah. Is that true, or is that because you're controlling crap? Good questions. Mary Beth or Rachel, anybody else? You have any reading recommendations from Melvi on that? People that you could think of? I read just about anybody. So I don't follow any particular theorist, therapist or theorist, and I'll read all kinds of novels, articles, and whatnot, and I get some of that from those things. So it's not necessarily a theoretical model per se. And what big part of it is just asking the question, how do you do it? Mary Beth, or Rachel, any got thoughts about it?
I really like the love languages. It's
Mhm.
but not any, like I don't know of anything else. I just wanted to reinforce that.
Thank you.
Yeah, in culturally speaking, I remember I did doing a diversity training, and I told somebody that Asian Americans, I'm Chinese American, we're not that touchy feely, in Asian culture, and part of it is probably because the kind of society it's in, and also like I don't know if you know about infant when Chinese have a baby, we don't celebrate the birthday until 1 month later. Koreans wait at least 90 days, 90 days or 100 days. Why is that? Because infant mortality was so horrible historically, So to celebrate a birth of a baby that may die within the first week or two, that's a horrible thing. So you wait. And there's other things about being stoic because of feudal society, emperors and so forth, warlords and whatnot. So I said, I was telling you, yeah, I said, I don't remember the last time since I've been a kid, my mom giving me a hug, and this skinny white lady goes, oh, like this pity tone. I'm going to go out and punch her face in. How dare you condescend me? I know my mom loves me. You know how I know she loves me? Because she feeds me. Because that's a classic, pretty cross-cultural way of showing affection and love. Food, you know. So, but there's also other ones, with that love languages and so forth. That's also why dieting can be so challenging, because food is manifested in cultural ways to love, to bond. I mean, this is what this Thanksgiving thing. Um, and then the whole deprivation of food, dieting, is like sometimes it's deprivation of love, attachment, the bonding stuff. And the other aspect of us is food as a way to self-soothe emotionally and psychologically. It's just very, very difficult, because and you run into those things as well. Types and patterns. What are the types and patterns? Of let's see, talk about batterers. Okay. Batterers share a common profile. They're unpredictable, unable to be influenced by partners, sometimes impossible to begin to prevent from battering once the argument has started. So this perpetrator is triggered, and basically the partner already knows where it's going to go. They try to de-escalate, but they just trigger to go. Women tend not to be batterers as much as men, but that's only tends. That's not absolute. And some of it I don't quite trust, as opposed to the men battering women. Yeah, obviously everybody looks down on it, but it's also acceptable. The rule of thumb supposedly is that you could beat a woman with a thumb, with a stick, as long as it's not thicker than your thumb. That's an old interpretation. So it's normal. men had a right to beat their wives, girlfriends. But women, the idea of women beating men is like, oh, that's how you let yourself do that, as a man and so forth. But it's not, women batter too. But the thing is, since women usually estimate 30% less upper body strength, not going to do as much damage. And also women, in terms of the emotional aspect of it, women and girls are more trained to have emotions, have anxiety, fear, loss, hurt, and things like that, and are also culturally allowed to talk about it with girlfriends, with friends, to otherwise get it out. When a guy has that betrayal, abandonment, or rejection, who do they talk about it to? Are they allowed to talk about it, or are they supposed to suck it up? So there's that part of it. So I don't really trust that. I know that's what they say statistically, and there's also situations where not only do they mutually batter each other, but it's the woman who starts it in a heterosexual couple. She starts it, but she's not as big and strong as he is. So when he retaliates, or joins in, does way more damage. So you could actually classify batterers into two types: people who simmer, and then they erupt into violence, and then those who strike out immediately. Okay, this is a really important difference. Especially if you're trying to leave. If you're trying to leave the relationship, so that's part of your assessment. So that might be a situation you work with somebody who's trying to leave a battering situation. You want to ask them, does your partner simmer, tension build up, and then they explode on you, or does it bam happen out of nowhere? Because you prepare for it differently. Also, with the simmering type, is that the simmering type, the theory would be that if you catch it earlier, you might be able to prevent it from building up. In other words, the simmering might have steps to it, and there might be interventions in the steps. Emotional abuse is usually a huge part of it. Domestic violence can decrease on its own. Interesting statement. Domestic violence can decrease on its own, but it almost never stops. Battered women do leave at high rates, despite the danger that they face. And when are women at the most risk of extreme violence, even homicide, is when they're leaving. Another form of domestic violence that you really understand is important is that not striking somebody, but blocking them, not letting somebody leave the room, holding them against their will, being blocked from leaving the room, being blocked from leaving the house or their apartment, having the cell phone withheld from them so they can't call for help. Now, this is in addition to the striking, the choking. This one group, one theorist calls certain types of abuser pit bulls, because they grow more and more aggressive until they finally attack. These men are about 80% of batterers, according to this study. They have contempt for women, but yet are extremely dependent on them. Wow. Think about some people in public eye that we hear about. The contempt. So that's the disrespect. See, remember, the disrespect leads to that entitlement. Self-righteousness, disrespect, entitlement. And it's probably insecurity, like we said. So one of the things you're going to be doing, like say this Madeline and Dirk thing, is that if the Madeline character is describing what's happening at home, pay real careful attention to how he interprets it, how he responds to it. Some people who are the narcissistic types, they actually have a different memory. There's a cognitive distortion. And what they'll do is so Madeline tries to describe something that happened. And what someone like Dirk might do is constantly interrupt to correct it, to correct her, to tell what really happened. The correction. So, and if you allow that to happen, allow the interruptions to happen, then someone like Madeline will start to doubt their own memories. And this is one of the key issues about narcissism. Narcissists will distort memory and experiences to serve their self-image, to serve their narrative. But they aren't lying in the sense of saying something that's false, because they say it once, they say it twice, it must be true. They really actually believe it. And they're so adamant about believing it, and so they can be so clear about it, they could get you to believe that you remembered it wrong. So getting someone like Madeline to doubt herself, and in an extreme form, that's that movie Gaslighting, which is about that. Go ahead, Mary Beth.
Oh no, I was just going to ask if that's gaslighting, and then you answered it.
Yeah. See, the nuance of it is gaslighting is purposeful. The person knows that they're fooling you, making you think differently. The narcissist actually thinks it's true. Like, out there's a political figure who really thinks, the election went that way, that these things happened, because it's intolerable, unbelievable that it could be any other way. Guess what? There's a lot of people who believe it because they need to believe it, and that's from anywhere on the political spectrum. It's a characterological issue. When someone like Madeline is describing what's happened, how much does someone like Dirk interrupt? But also, how much empathy do you see him showing? Is there empathy or denial? Whatever you think might work, whatever you think should happen and it doesn't happen, either it doesn't work or it doesn't happen, that's more information. There's more information to learn about him. That tells you something about Dirk, Now, then you watch like Dirk, how is he emotionally responding to like Madeline's describing the what happens at home. You might get more angry, but also might feel misunderstood, misrepresented, and so there could be a variety of emotions. Interesting thing is that some people, there even there might be observable emotional arousal and greater verbal aggression, arguing with her, so forth. There's others that actually get calmer and quieter. This person calls them cobras. 20% who get calmer, and they actually have a decrease in their heart rate. Do you know there's a personality disorder where there's a decrease in heart rate? It's called sociopathy, antisocial personality disorder. They're more likely to have used or threatened to use a knife or gun on their wives, and they also tend to be more violent, more extremely violent. These are the most dangerous ones. That there's a coldness to them, sociopathy. Much more likely to be antisocial, much more likely to have come from violent families, grew up in violent homes. Also more likely to depend on illegal drugs. Interesting, scary. So almost half of pit bull marriages dissolve within 2 years. But only 25% of women married to cobras left them. And they're seem to quite attached to them. Is that scary? And what's the logic to it? The logic to it is that somebody who lives with someone who's cold, calculating, that cruel, who's that dangerous, and that could be that violent. There's one person described her childhood as a war zone where her father would one day be absent, disengaged, and suddenly become physically abusive toward mother and all the kids. So guess what? They're used to it. How many times I tell you the root word for familiar is family? Yeah, it's a family pattern. Scary. So that's a different kind of domestic violence. Attachment's part of it, but it's different. This is a person who's much more likely to be chronically battered and even killed. The danger, and this is the ones where the people who do domestic violence work have tended to recommend it. Don't do couples therapy with them. Period. I differentiate that a little bit. So family patterns. One of the most established risk factors for violence in couples relationship is violence in the family of origin. That's why you ask, what happened? Did you see this at home growing up? Did it happen? Boys who observe conflict between parents are much more likely to externalize negative behaviors, such as aggression and conflict behavior. However, girls are more likely to internalize with anxiety and depression. Not surprising, huh? Not surprising, given the cultural manifestations. Look for traditional family models. And what's traditional family models? Patriarchy. Okay, but the nuance of patriarchy is also to be defined too. Like Latin Americans, Mexican Americans, the men oftentimes are criticized for being macho. Well, in the traditional healthy patriarchal model, being macho is not about being dominating and controlling. It's about being responsible, caring, and loving of family. That's what it means, So macho being a machismo, it's about family, But then, and in every culture, in fact, in every culture, even ones that have really strict traditional patriarchies, there are men who are loving, kind, respectful, collaborative, egalitarian with their partners, even within that. And guess what? There are men who can be really abusive because the patriarchal system makes it easier to do that. Within that cultural framework, there is reality that says Latino or Hispanic adolescent females are more likely to experience intimate partner violence compared to other ethnic groups. How come? Because socioeconomic status, which is one thing, but also because of the of other issues of Latino or Hispanic stress, which is language issues, cultural issues, and also, depending on the cultural pattern. Anything can be exploited in an inappropriate way or taken to an extreme, but also could be modulated. In African American families or couplehood, what's a stereotype that we speak to and we see and can manifest is that the 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 the, the stereotypical but also sometimes real experience of powerful African American women, powerful Black women who might have actually more social status and more economic status than male partners. How does that work out in terms of in a patriarchal and racist society in terms of potential conflicts? In other words, if you have a security about who you are, then you deal with all that. I mean, in my not being Black, but by being male, when my wife made more money than I did, or looked like she made more money than I did, it's like, yeah, great. We have more money. It didn't threaten me. I thought that was great, But then there's also, I do have grown up with patriarchal models and whatnot, and I do follow through on them sometimes. And when I'm confronted with them, and when I'm held accountable to them, when I might be manifesting in some way that is not as healthy as it should be, it's not hard for me to let go of them, to make adjustments, because I have a basic security about myself. But there's other pressures, other things going on, you have to look at that. You look at is it more likely to cause violence? Because now one of the here's a couple of so I mentioned Latinos, I mentioned Asians, I mentioned Blacks. So among Asian couples, heterosexual Asian couple, the stereotype of Asian men is that we're supposed to be smart, nerdy, but we get emasculated. Okay, but emasculation is about power and control. Now, how's that going to manifest in a couple's relationship? It can manifest because that's always something to do with. In a black men, what's that stereotype? Is that they're hypersexual, physical, aggressive, but not that, but not as intelligent, not not breadwinners. How's that going to manifest in a couple's relationship? You know, the Latino men, the macho stuff, the role, the gangbanger thing. How's that going to manifest? You know, Jewish, Black, Asian, male, female, and then, you know, how's that manifest in same-sex couples? And you know, and it turns out that, you know, domestic violence is prevalent, arguably as prevalent in same-sex couples. But what's an additional issue? An additional issue is that, especially in previous generations, maybe less so now, maybe a little bit less so now, but somebody has to go through hell in order to be out. Somebody has to go through hell in order to assert their relationship, and they end up with a batterer. Oh, fuck. So now, so who do you turn to? Friends and family who may not have been down with you being out or gay. And there's the humiliation, the aspects as well. And there's the whole thing of trying to look good, sound good, which becomes, which can become an issue to maintain image, you know, maintain image. So there's those ramifications. But you know, the hypothesis that butch women are more likely to perpetuate and femme women are more likely to be victimized is not supported by their research and analysis. This is from something I found in my book. Okay. Now, there's also, however, just I mentioned the Latino stress or whatever else, the concept of minority stress. Anytime you are not mainstream of the most privileged group, there's a possibility of minority stress, which is of being Black, of being a person of color, being gay, being a woman, you know, being from working class. There's issues with the stress that do that. So lesbian women are doubly stressed as women and as sexual minorities. You know, and trans and being bisexual or gender fluid is the new gay in the past, what, 10, 20 years, where, you know, 20, 30 years ago, you know, we didn't talk about that, you know, so even within the communities, the LGBTQ community, there's also divisions and differences as well. So lesbian women of color are triply stressed. Ethnicity, you know, sexual orientation, being a female. Oh yeah. Oh, you want to add another one? Maybe working class, poverty. You know, you just keep on adding the stress issues. So why does it matter? Because if stress contributes to relationship issues, intimacy issues, if stress compromises communication and connection, that means stress, any kind of stresses, anytime you add more stress, domestic violence potentially becomes more likely and also more problematic. How do you unpack it all? How do you unpack it all? You know? Oh yeah. Oh, don't forget internalized homophobia, internalized racism. And then social isolation, social injustices, relational aggression. Male bullying tends to be hierarchical, which is that I knock you down the hierarchy. I make you dumber than me, less access than me, less power than me. Okay, so I knock you down the hierarchy, less status. Relational aggression, which is sometimes characterized as more female style aggression, is that relational aggression or relational bullying is about exclusion. You're not cool. You're not cute. You don't wear the same cool outfits that we do. We exclude you. You know, so it's a social aggression. And one of the reasons why it's called more of a feminine aggression is that male aggression tends to be more hierarchical, knock you down the social status. But then if you're knocked down the social status hierarchy, then you can hang out with the other nerds. You can hang out with the other people who are the second class citizens. In female or relational aggression, you get ejected from the group, period. There is no group of other isolates. You're isolated. So in that sense, especially since female culture tends to be more socially involved and collaborative and so forth, it can be terrifyingly annihilating. And women will do that, girls will do that to each other. Gay women, lesbian women will do that to each other. And interestingly enough, gay men have a greater propensity to do that apparently than straight men. But of course, none of it's exclusive. Straight men obviously can do this to each other as well. You're not part of my club, ostracizing and so forth. But that kind of bullying as well. Now, this also fits into, in terms of relationships, in terms of domestic violence, is that the sense of isolating you from a partner, isolating you from your friends. Yeah, I've worked with quite a few people, and the first inkling of things being bad is that the partner wouldn't let them talk to their friends. The partner, would exclude, it would make them force them not to go to the family occasions, isolating to that normal cohort group. Got any thoughts about this? The emotional violence, domestic violence in the worlds that the people that you know, familiar with, and also at the Pacific Center, if that's coming up. Pacific Center in Berkeley is an LGBTQ focus.
I haven't worked with any couples yet. I'm not an expert in queer, all things queer, but I try.
You're
to...
experienced. Wait a second. You know the difference between an expert and a professional? The classic definition. Is the difference between expert and professional is at some point someone pays the professional. That's it.
Yeah, I haven't seen any couples. So, and I haven't seen any issues of domestic violence. The way you talked about social isolation, I hadn't ever conceptualized it that way. And especially with women sort of ostracizing people and not like, once you're out, you're out. And that's true with gay men as well. And I think that I'm really curious about that in the way of thinking about where do non-binary folks fit into that and where do trans folks fit into that, and not fitting in those groups, and what happens. And I imagine that there is there are studies that show that queer and trans and people are more isolated and have higher rates of depression and all of that. And I wonder if that social isolation and the ostracizing plays a part in that. And I'm sure it does.
My experience sometimes is that, like with gay men, some gay men I've interacted with is that they carry pretty much most, if not all, of the male energy and stereotypes, manifestations. So they're like gay men. And then there's gay men who don't carry that. They're not like a guy like most guys are, somewhat, whatever that is. And the same thing with women, is that gay women, lesbian women, that's same also true, which is that some of them are very femme, kind of classically way, and then others aren't, and there's varieties in that, the nuance of that. And that's kind of like what you want to, just kind of what you're trying to figure out. So like, for instance, like I've worked with some some lesbian couples, and the two couples that off the top of my head I could think of that come to mind is that both of them presented pretty femme. And the interesting thing about it was that as both of them present pretty femme, still when we talked about what did you see in your family, what did you experience in your family, they still carried those dynamics. It's just like, I'm a guy, I have a mother and a father, but probably in terms of personality and so forth, I reflect more from my mom because she's the one that was more impactful to me. So it kind of depends. Hey, Mary Beth, maybe that's going to be your thesis, huh? Maybe you're going to explore that in your thesis, huh? Yeah, because it sounds really relevant. It's like, how do you, how does that play out? Because because these are stereotypes, but they also like men will do exclusion, the social thing. But generally speaking, that's why the Mean Girl movies are called the Mean Girl movies, because it is about ostracizing the other females and so forth. You know, and the boys, you know, it's more like getting beaten up, dominated, pushed into the toilet, things like that. You know, so it's a different. It plays out differently. Yeah, Rachel.
I was just thinking I've not worked with any couples yet either. I work a lot either in a low secure forensic unit, and I also do a lot of work at a crisis survivors centre. And I've worked with quite a lot of individuals in one-to-one therapy where they've then chosen to be in a homosexual relationship because of previous abuse and issues to do with fear, control, power with someone from the opposite sex. And I suppose it just made me curious the way the conversation was going. Would you work any differently with such a couple in couples therapy? Because then it's an active choice. And I'm thinking how that is also then going to play, again, be different for everyone and also within the dynamics of their relationship. But again, their whole concept of self and identity, all of those areas.
You know, one of the things to really understand is that as much as you know, it's just as important to know what you don't know, and really is to ask the questions. You know, so one of the reasons I know as much as I do about all kinds of people is that I've been a therapist. You know, my first practicum was in 1988. You know, and I've worked with all kinds of people, do it purposefully, and I ask questions. You know, so I read some, I study some, but I ask questions. You know, so this is why a lot of times I give examples from clients, because I ask, uh, you know, how's, uh, so how does it affect you? You know, how did your family argue? Um, what was, what was your experience with people that were different than you? What was your experience of being different? You know, and so in that sense, these are general questions. It's kind of like sometimes you don't know what's under the rock, but you know you need to look under the rock. You know, and a lot of times, like Mary Beth was comment earlier when it said that, like, not getting anything past me, which is that you say something and somebody goes, and you go, what's that? What's that? What's that? What's that? you know, In other words, or they say something, says, well, what? You know, or said, well, that doesn't seem that important. Tell me about that. You know, and people throw out where there's purpose for not little hints and cues. You know, and it's just go explore it. So the more you know, the more you've experienced, the more likely you're able to chase after something. But at the same time, there's some general things, which is how people think, what their value system is, male and female roles, what the role of children is, what the role of elders are, what is it about money, what is it about food, uh, how safe is it, how appropriate is it to be assertive and being aggressive? Is it different for males or females? What's different, what's not different? I mean, one of the things I learned from one of my Native American clients was that in the Southwest Native Americans, there is a type of person who is basically gender fluid. That's known and accepted in the Native American community there. So that's not different. So when she saw that her son was like that, child was this gender fluid type of person, kind of spirit, it didn't throw her off. I didn't know that specifically, but now I do. Speaking of Native Americans, many years ago, there was this couple that had a kid they were foster parents for. They were not biologically related, but in the Sioux Native American community, is that if somebody's having trouble with their kids and so forth, somebody in the community steps up and takes care of them. There doesn't have to be blood relatives. In other words, there's a traditional foster care situation, tradition in that community. Well, that sounds pretty cool. That's interesting. You look Asian, I guess, Rachel, but I'm not sure. But in San Francisco, there is a lot of Asians, but there's not as many Asians in the foster care system. Why is that? Because there's not as many kids that need it? No, because in the Asian community, Chinese community predominantly, but other Asian communities in San Francisco, the extended family foster care system activates normally. So you start learning things like that. And you start asking those questions. Who's the extended family? Who's the person that touched you? Who's the person that supported you? You start learning those things. So it really is just keep on having the repertoire of questions, and start drawing upon them. And just ask. You don't have to know. You don't have to know. You just know to ask. And that's actually really supportive, really powerful.
Can I just say a huge thank you? By the way, I'm white British. I'm not Asian, but anyway, but thank you very much for making this workshop available to other people outside of your students. It's very much appreciated. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much. Any other last comments? We're going to catch up with you guys next time, whenever the next time scheduled. I'm not sure where it is.
No, it was wonderful. Thank you, Ronald.
Okay. Hope keep on asking questions, being curious. Nothing's definitive. It's like if it doesn't work for you, just figure out what does work for you. Joe Barrow, who's always called me professor, and I always thought professors profess they know everything. I'm not really. I don't think I profess. I just put it out there. You guys figure out what makes sense to you. Okay. See how it resonates in your life. Okie dokie. Have a good holiday. Stay healthy, everybody.